Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion.
Hey, Erin.
Hey, Kelley.
How's it going?
You know, it's a beautiful day here in St. Louis. We finally shooken off. What's the right? I don't even know what the right term is there.
Shit off.
Yeah. The winter weather. Earlier this week it was like blowing snow, and now it's like sunny and beautiful here. So
yeah, and tomorrow is my favorite day of the year.
Oh, the spring forward. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's your favorite day of the year?
Yes, because we get more time. We get more lights.
I mean, I would be fine if we just like kept it that way, but like
All the time?
all the switching is like, it's actually really bad for people that, you know, there's like studies that show that like more people die the week after daylight savings of like heart attacks, car accidents.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
like, yeah, it's because it really messes with people's circadian rhythms and it's like bad for your brain. So,
Okay, well, I'm sorry for that, but I am excited because it's going to be light later.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So then they just need to stay on it, like just switch it and stay.
Yeah,
just stay on the.
Yeah. Well, we're changing maps and all kinds of things, so we might as well change that, right? Please.
I just got back from Mexico.
Good.
I just got back from Mexico, and that was like we were with a tour guide, and he was like making jokes about the Gulf of America. We were like on the Gulf. I was like, oh dear.
Oh dear. Well, I am super excited about this conversation we're having today with David Morris. We talk about books a lot on our podcast. In fact, I've had friends who say that once we mention a book 3 times in the podcast, they add it to their list and they say they have to read it. And that's going to be a good thing for David to know because David is a publisher who comes to us. David is the publisher at Lake Drive Books, and he's a literary agent and also an author. And he's been in publishing for 25 years. And prior to Lake Drive Books, which has been around for about 3 years, which is a newer publishing house that he started, he was at Zondervan, a division of HarperCollins, and Zondervan is a Christian publishing company, and we're really excited to hear about his work at Lake Drive and hear about the books that he's published because he has, I think, an interesting story and an interesting goals for the books that he puts out that I think are very much in line with kind of the things that we're talking about on our podcast. So, David, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me here. It's great to be here. It's great to meet you both. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. So can you start by just telling us a little bit about kind of the story of Lake Drive and kind of what caused you to, and kind of what your kind of mission is with the publishing house and kind of how you got there?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've been in corporate publishing for almost 30 years. And, learned a lot about publishing. I saw a lot of different sides to it. My first job was actually working with contracts, as well as editing, acquiring. It was more of a direct mail book buyer role in a way for that particular business. But I've just had a chance to see it all. I've witnessed the changes in publishing. It's been a drastic change in the last 20 years. The digital revolution happening and all of that. And then, I wound up being the publisher at a major evangelical religious publishing imprint, part of HarperCollins, Zondervan, and then found myself on the outside of that company, which is mostly a story of consolidation, which is what's been going on in the book publishing business. A lot of publishers buying up each other, buying up the mid-sized publishers. Where I worked, they had bought, HarperCollins had bought the other really big evangelical publishing house, Thomas Nelson, and merged them just before I got there. And then I was there 7 years. But my position basically was moved to Nashville. Zondervan really isn't in Grand Rapids like it used to be. There's not a building that houses a lot of people. I think there's some sort of satellite office here. Um, so, it was the pandemic, and, I was kind of trying to figure out what did I want to do with the rest of my publishing career, and had a lot of lofty goals, thought I had to get that big corporate job again, felt a lot of pressure about it. And then I just started digging into learning how to do a small indie, what's called a hybrid publisher in my case. There's a lot of technology that makes it available today for really, low scale grassroots publishing to be possible. In fact, it's grown quite a bit. There's an Independent Book Publishers Association. I heard the CEO say that a third of all books are published by indie publishers, which really is an
Wow.
influential segment of the publishing market. Granted, some of that is vanity publishing, but there's vanity publishing on the upper level too. I can tell you, I've been there.
Yeah.
So, I just thought, I've always been attuned to the changing landscape of religion in the United States. I did my PhD dissertation on it, on people losing their faith and how they find their way forward. And, I thought I really would like to resource that crowd. There's a strong sense of loss when they come out of their communities, when they're leaving their churches or attending them less. It's a loss of identity. There's a lot of issues that are swept under the rug, not just for those who are leaving out, but by the churches in general. And so the books tend to focus on that. I say that they're books for books that help you heal, grow, and discover, which is sort of like a soft, gentle way of talking about books that look at real issues, gritty issues, real life stories, and help you try to find a way forward. Not that there's huge solutions out there. We've got to really work hard to find them. And a little bit of self-help, because I have a psychology background. And I see that that's sort of, in a way too, just speaking very almost philosophically, my background in psychology, one thing I learned, psychology and religion, is how psychology and science have taken space from where religion used to occupy.
Yeah.
In terms of how we define the inner life. It's also, looking at the inner life is also a somewhat sociological subversion. That's kind of a strong word to use at this point, but it's one of the ways that we reshape society, by looking inward. And so I see a very strong sense of mission and even justice in there. I'll publish books about justice if I can. A lot of publishers are snapping those up right now, some of the progressive houses, because they really like to focus on that. But I think I'm looking at a bigger movement of how do we find who we are in this world going forward, and justice is a part of that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think that actually, what you're just describing is really kind of what our show is about, right? Like these different ways that people, explore the inner life. What are the different paths? How are they, in similar or different, like depending on the route you go, right? The psychology science route or the religion route. And you can see like parallels, and there's so much similarity in like those paths. Like you're all trying to get to the same place, I think, right? They're just like these different vehicles that people are using to explore the inner life. I'm curious about your dissertation. Like when you were doing that research and it's like, okay, what's the way forward? What did you find? Like what did the research find?
Sure. Yeah. So my background is in psychoanalysis and religion. So, Freud, Jung, and Erickson, the object relations theorists, Winnicott, Klein, and that's what Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion. So you try to look underneath things, You look underneath what people are saying when they're talking about God or they're talking about religion, um, and you find out that they're talking more about themselves than anything else. But I was
Yeah.
combined that with, it was an interdisciplinary program where I went to at Drew University in New Jersey. Um, I combined that with a fair amount of sociological thinking as well, and sort of looked at how what we're going through in the U.S. is sort of there's one secondary literature thinker named Peter Homans out of the University of Chicago talk about common culture, how we've lost a common culture. Um, I applied that, or I think about that in like a macro and a micro level, sociologically speaking. Um, the common culture we lost when so many of us of European descent, our ancestors came over from Europe, lost our homelands, our motherlands, and how did that impact on that? What kind of an impact did that have on us? Um, and and to a very great extent, um, the fact that the United States is so religious is because, well, we used religion to replace that identity, that old world identity that we might have had.
Mm.
Um, but then, in recent decades, so many of us are leaving, especially recent years, leaving churches, and that's a sense of loss. So I tried to sort of situate a pretty big context, though, to end up talking about how one way of looking at how we're dealing with religion is mourning it.
Mm.
So just like you lose someone in your life, you're going to go through a process of disorientation. You could even, you can apply whatever mourning theory you want. I used Freud's theory of mourning and melancholia being kind of like the numbness that you feel, the inability to sort of look inward. Depression. Mourning is more feeling the feelings and getting angry and the object of your faith surviving and being able to reincorporate it in new ways, to rediscover it in new ways. So that's what I looked at. And I put 5 spiritual memoirs on the couch and just sort of did an ethnography of those people, because I found in memoirs, like spiritual memoirs, the people's stories sort of hold still a little bit and you can get underneath them a little bit better than just doing interviews, at least in the environment of trying to get a dissertation done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and I think I made some good discoveries there. I've learned a lot since then as well. But one of them just being that, you've got to make it your own. You gotta find your way forward. I think one of the best examples is there's a book called The House Where the Hardest Things Happened. I think it's out of print now. Author's name is Kate Young Cayley, and her family was kicked out of their church when she was 5. And you read her book, and she reflects back on her 5-year-old self and acknowledges how depressed she was as a 5-year-old.
Oh.
Suffering depression from being kicked out of this community because her mother had to work in a restaurant that served alcohol. But one of the biggest healing moments in that book was when she wound up becoming a Sunday school teacher herself. So if you've gone through this is not necessarily the path for everybody. If you've gone through a difficult church experience and you've left, but you're trying to find your way forward again, and I'm not necessarily recommending people go this way, but teaching young children, even your own children, can really have a healing effect for you. It's more constructive in that sense.
There's so many thoughts going through my head right now, but one of the things, as you're saying this idea of mourning, but also this idea of kind of reconstructing, that just articulates for me, for a long time, I would go to church. I couldn't go to church without crying. And there was this sense of it was like the sense of nostalgia. And it wasn't the experience I was having in the moment in the service, but this kind of this touching back to something that was like when things were like innocent and formative and just in beautiful in that kind of innocence way. So there was that, but then deconstruction kind of happens, right? And you're like, Well, I don't want to just sit here and cry. I want it to be, I want it to be formative and beneficial to me now. I don't want to just harken back to something. And that's when this kind of work starts happening, where you start kind of articulating what is faith for you now and moving forward. Um, do you recognize that and what you were talking about?
Well, I certainly like being in church service or being around those people, being around people in a church,
Mm-hmm.
it taps into, lifelong um, memories and
Yeah.
thoughts and identity, and it's very unconscious and a sense of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think we have a lot of reasons in the United States to feel a sense of existential angst.
Mm-hmm.
We're probably more dislocated from each other than we've been in a long time. But I mean, we kind of already were in a way, as I mentioned, being kind of cut off from before. Um, and I think church taps into that. That's one of the things, like in the deconstruction conversation. When you left a church, the people who are still in it, they have no idea why have you left, and it's very hard. It's very hard to have left.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a part of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's so wrapped up in your unconscious.
Yeah, and that leaving is actually it for me, and I think for a lot of the people that I work with as a spiritual director, that leaving is leaving, like I'm ready to leave the grief. Like I can still stay there in community and be in grief and grieving even while I'm in community, but there's something about leaving and saying, okay, now I'm gonna move forward.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. Who were the five
Memoirs.
memoirs that you
Yeah,
gave?
sure. Yeah. So there was Young Kaylee. There was a woman by the name of Carlene Cross. She has a book called Fleeing Fundamentalism. She was married to an abusive pastor, charismatic abusive pastor that she met at a small Bible college. I was fascinated with how she used to keep biblical studies books in her closet to sort of create her own escape and redemption.
Mm.
Mm,
Um, Redemption is not the right word, but just fleeing, figuring out who she was.
Yeah.
One was Diana Butler Bass's book,
mhm,
Strength for the Journey. She
mhm.
was more of a stayer, so that was like a
Yeah.
contrast. Randall Balmer's book about his father. He's the historian of religion. He's at Ivy League college. I'm trying to remember which one. He has a real mournful tone in his writing,
Mm,
which is something I tried to pick up on. What's the tone of the writing?
mm,
Mm.
It's like when you read like Bart Ehrman. Have you ever read Bart Ehrman, the biblical studies
mhm.
scholar? It says he's an atheist. Well, if you listen to him talk, he sounds like a Baptist pastor.
Right.
What's going on there? You got to ask
Right.
yourself that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, uh, and there was another woman who attended both a Unitarian and I think an Episcopal church at the same time, and that provided an interesting contrast as well. So I think that's about five.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you at Drew when Catherine Keller there when you were there?
Yeah, yeah. She was more in the theology section. I was in the religion and society section.
Okay.
So I'm
Okay.
wired to think more like a social scientist of religion. I mean, I
Yeah.
grew up evangelical, but
Yeah.
I didn't, theology wasn't my specialty, confessional approached.
Yeah.
I'm more like, you know, let's try to see what's really going on here, when
Yeah.
behind this religion that we're in. Like sometimes when people talk about God, yeah, they really are talking about their father, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
And I
Yeah.
wish
Right.
more
Yeah.
people would admit that to themselves if
Yes.
they'd see that. It's a great critique. It's reductionistic, but it's a great critique. I'll tell you the thing where it gets spiritual for me in that work is when you really learn to listen to and pay attention to each other and what's going on. Um, one of my favorite thinkers and writers is the child psychoanalyst Eric Erikson. He had a very
Hmm.
famous book in the 50s called Childhood and Society. And I'm such a nerd, I will still open it up and read it sometimes. But when you see him write his um, when he analyzes someone, and let's look at his book, Young Man Luther, or his book on Gandhi, he has a way of looking at their childhood, looking at their social situation, their cultural milieu, what they're trying to do in their own life. And he talked about like life history and the historical moment, which is this moment when a person like that somehow connects with the world around them and something magical happens. And to hear him describe people from all these different points of view, I love that stuff. I mean, I'm like an introvert. I grew up a pastor's kid who was like tired of listening to hippies become Jesus freaks in the 70s because it was just like the same story over and over again. It's like, okay, but to have such sensitivity to what's going on in life around you, that's something that I've found really fascinating about being a social scientist of religion, at least thinking that way. How did you guys come across the topic of psychology and social life? That's in your own podcast description.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we are both interested in, but I'm sort of like really passionate about understanding human psychology, and the social sciences, and it's just like sort of, I don't know, like it's something I've studied. I have a master's in American culture studies, so just trying to kind of like understand why does society operate the way that it does? How do like as individual agents do we operate in this, like how does the culture change how us as individual operators are like making decisions or not making decisions, like that are just so much of what we are is sort of like just default, right? We just kind of move through the world by these forces that we don't tend to spend a lot of time like asking why. And I've always been someone who's like, well, wants to ask why.
Yeah, and I think I was raised evangelical, went to Wheaton, like did all the evangelical things, but my dad was a pastor's kid also. And so there were like big gaps in obviously, like I just think a lot of evangelicals have a lot of big gaps in their spiritual understanding and historical understanding of the church, and I started kind of filling in those gaps later in life, and just through kind of spiritual practices. I started studying like meditation, and I started studying Buddhism, and I'm very interested in science. Like, what are the scientific ideas that actually support spiritual practice and validate spiritual practice? And then Erin and I, and often Justin, we would just be having a beer and be having these huge discussions about these things, coming at them from really different perspectives. And we were like, yeah, this is the most fun ever. Let's just keep talking about this. And,
Yeah.
and I found that for me, I was learning more and growing more in my quote unquote faith by reading books and studying theology and doing these things that were never really on the table for me later than I ever did really like in a church service.
Right.
Like the church service was like it was like I could be emotional and it could tap into kind of an emotive thing, but it wasn't feeding me intellectually. I was a philosophy major in undergrad, so I just that's kind of where I started getting excited again.
Well, I think that speaks that there's like as much as so many of us love our churches or our church backgrounds, perhaps, or if you don't at this point, it's still very effective for so many people. And yet there's so many like there's a disconnect in there too. Like how can someone who's like college educated, maybe even studies science, like believe in a personality that's an actual supernatural personality existing somewhere that's thinking about your every move and so on?
Yeah.
You could say, well, it's just a leap of faith. Well, okay, but let's talk about that. And then, there's all kinds of things that come around that, like, do you believe in the world is, 6,000 years old, or,
Right.
Right.
4.3 billion years old.
Yeah.
And you have to look at how, like the United States. I talk in my you guys noticed in my book description, I talk about how Americans are obsessed with religion.
Mhm.
It is for a Western post-industrial country. It is like way more religious in terms of the number of people who are like showing up in church, who talk about God, who say they pray. And yet it's very educated at the same
Yeah.
time, and kind of affluent as well.
Mhm.
It doesn't it so there's a disconnect there. It's formed a sense of community and emotion, but it's also very socially constructed, and it's about a lot of other things that we don't say out loud. Like, one of the things that never adds up for me about churches is, like, okay, you're supposed to read the Bible all the way through, right? You're supposed to be really familiar with the Bible.
Yeah.
And book publishing, I knew a guy in Bible publishing who would read it like through like 3 times a year. And I just like, what are you doing with, like, don't you have something else to do with your free time?
There are more books. There are more
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. But then you show up in churches, and pastors never touch a lot of parts of the Bible
Yeah.
that might actually be kind of fascinating.
Um,
Or they won't dig into, um, let's bring up Bart Ehrman again. Just read some Bart Ehrman and ponder the fact that Second Philippians was probably not written by Paul. So what does that mean? How did the Bible come together? Well, that's actually really fascinating, and I'd like to learn about that, as opposed to hearing about the story of Job for the 100th time in my life.
Right.
And what spiritual lessons I'm supposed to take out of that. But we don't do that.
Right. What do you think are I'm curious, like Christian publishing, like I do think like there are more people like me who are turning to books to kind of learn more about my faith or the history or the psychology or social science around religion. Who what books do you think are kind of the most influential books on Christian thinking in the last few years? Like if our listeners were like, I want to expand my knowledge.
Yeah, that's
I know that's a kind of a big question.
it's a tough one too, because I read some things that are a little more obscure. I read a really good book a while back on the Great Awakenings. It's like history of religion in the United States. And it basically says, the title is Inventing the Great Awakenings. It's by a couple of historians, and they locate a lot of the fervor around some of these meetings that happened then around places where they had newspapers, which goes to show you the connection between publishing and religion.
Yeah.
So it's called Inventing the Great Awakening. What is some of the big thinking going on? Honestly, it feels like, I think people what's really hot right now are the people who are telling stories from underneath. You've got Tia Levings's book. What was it called? A Well-Trained Wife, about her growing up in the patriarchy movement. Someone I worked with who has a book out from Erdman's called Rift, Kate West's book about Rift, her growing up in the patriarchy movement. There are purity culture books. I think we're kind of going through an accounting period, and we're trying to see our faith for what it really, for all of what it is. Let's put it that way. There are some Black authors, but surprisingly very few, because publishing, even on the progressive side, is still very white in terms of how it brings authors up through the system. At Lake Drive Books, we have Trey Ferguson's Theologizing Bigger, which is about, the idea of looking at a God that's a lot bigger than just a literal fundamentalist God. I feel like I feel like things along race, class, and gender
Mhm.
and sexuality
Mhm.
are where most of the cool conversations are going on. Not that we're striving to be cool, but
Mhm.
interesting.
Mhm.
Um, I have a book on at Lake Drive Books called Intersection, which is a journalist telling the story of an intersex friend of hers.
Mhm.
And you read this book, and we also have a book by Brandon Flannery called Stumbling, Growing Up Queer in uh, Evangelical, coming out of evangelicalism. I'm sorry, I'm botching the subtitle. But what I say about that book, and I would say this about intersection, is you might know someone who's queer or trans or even intersex, but have you ever really heard their story?
Mhm.
And I think right now it's not so much about intellectual pursuits. It seems less about that now that you bring it up that
Mhm.
way, than
Mhm.
Mhm.
it is about hearing stories that we've kept
Mhm.
hidden. When you read this book, Intersection, it's like you have no idea what this person has gone through,
Mhm.
growing up through junior high and dealing with peers and or even starting earlier when the doctor and the parents identified this person as a girl, but always felt male
Mhm.
his whole life. And you also learn about this person who has a little bit more rare version of intersex in terms of their physiology, but there is physiology that is not clear cut.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Um, and and then you kind of have to go, okay, well, especially when you hear this person's story, you kind of go, well, if you believe in God, God made this person
Yeah.
Mhm.
this way. So how do you deal with binaries of,
Mhm.
you know, male and female that we tend to attribute in conservative evangelicalism?
Mhm.
That really throws a monkey wrench in it. And
Mhm.
I think if we're just, I think that's what a lot of people are trying to do right now is tell those stories. In the evangelical marketplace, um, there are a number of books that are coming out from those who establish big followings
Mhm.
with major publishers like T. Levings, for example. Um, Dan McClellan, who's a biblical studies guy, he's got a big Instagram account. A lot of fun to follow him.
Mhm.
Dan McClellan.
We gotta uh hit the Instagram follower publishing thing too at some point. Like
Yeah,
I know so many people who have such great stories and they're like, I'm never gonna get it published because I only have 5,000 followers.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
That's a big metric, I'm assuming. I
yeah.
mean,
We could
like,
talk about that. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. I didn't mean to interrupt
No, no,
the
no.
thing, but
Yeah,
I do know that's a big deal.
yeah, yeah. And I think what's interesting is that um, people get pretty cynical about social media, but when you're talking about social change, there's actually a lot of activity that's amazing that's going on.
Hmm.
Um, you know, you can form a sense of community uh, with an alternative point of view, and it can really take off. Um, I mean, granted, you kind of have to be good at video.
Hmm.
It helps if you're mediagenic
Yep.
sometimes, which isn't always fair, but it's
Yeah.
not the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
You can succeed in other ways as well on online like that. But yeah, I mean that's really more of at least in book publishing, kind of a marketplace structural issue. What happened in publishing around, oh, I don't know when the right year would be, but when social media started kicking in, there's actually two things that happened. Um, the digital revolution brought on two things. One is Amazon.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So a lot of physical bookstores went out of business, scaled way back. There's some coming back. Indie stores are coming back. Barnes and Noble is coming back a little bit too, but as an indie store philosophy, it's really interesting.
Mm.
Um, and yes, but e-distribution really just blew the water out of what was going on in publishing.
Hmm.
It's not e-book revolution, it's e-distribution. That's what happened. Print is still king,
Yeah.
um, especially in nonfiction. Um, and so an entry level author especially would like 95% of their sales are on Amazon, and people
Yeah.
don't realize it. It's that ubiquitous.
Yeah, that
Mhm.
dominant.
Yeah, yeah. It's just and it's really just a matter of convenience, whether you agree with it or not. It's the convenience that just made it work
Yep.
so well.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, it's an inevitability, really. So that was happening, that digital revolution. I could say more about that in terms of distribution. But then on the other side of things, people were starting to find each other online. And when you start establishing that online platform, is that digital distribution is just a click away.
Yep.
You don't have to go to a bookstore or anything. It's just like
Mhm.
instant direct to consumer advertising.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so and the yeah, and so that's I think that's why, like, major houses like the big five houses, the New York houses, they really want to see like 25,000, 50,000 Instagram followers or even more on TikTok, because TikTok's a little bit less reliable
Mhm.
in that regard, depending.
Yeah.
Um, but there's still, yeah, and I mean, it's an interesting landscape. You do have a lot of those big publishers, and sorry, just stop me if I'm going on too much about it, because I can, and this is what I know. But there is a lot more celebrity books out there. There's
Yeah.
less, in a sense, less quality.
But I guess in some ways too, like prior to that, like the like a lot most of the writers would have been like journalists who had published, who had followers through newspapers or
Mhm.
things like that. So it's in some ways that it's kind of democratized, anybody can get
Yes.
50,000 followers if you're
Yeah.
doing the things that get you that. You don't have to have,
Yeah.
you don't have to be a columnist with the New York Times
It can still help a
anymore.
lot, but yeah.
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 Yeah, that's so true. Um, I often say to authors, the gatekeepers aren't there like they used to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter, it really doesn't matter, the color of your skin, your sexuality, your gender, your ideology, your background. If you can establish an online audience, an
Hmm.
online community, that leads to real community, you can make something happen. The challenge is it's democratized things quite a bit, but on the other hand, it's also made everything more segmented.
Mm-hmm.
There's less like mass culture. It used to
Yep.
be if you got a book deal, it's great because the publisher would get you into a bookstore, and that's where the readers were. It was pretty hard to get that book deal, but once you got it, yeah, you did kind of have it made,
Hmm.
kind of.
Hmm.
Now you kind of have to work that yourself with a much more segmented, much more vertical audience as opposed to a horizontal audience.
Hmm.
And that means it's harder to scale.
Hmm.
It's harder to make money,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
which is why I'm working so hard all the time on my indie imprint. Um, it's
Yeah.
it's not an automatic. And in the religious publishing space, if you're talking about the millions of people who have left churches in the last 10, 15, 20 years, literally millions, they're just not in the institutions anymore. We're not in
Right.
spaces where we can use that magic word of mouth
Hmm.
way of discovering books. So it's harder to get. I mean, that book I talked about, Intersection. I don't want to play favorites with my books, and if my authors are listening, they know I love them all. But that Intersection book, that is the one that was one of the most mind-blowing books we've published so
Mm.
far, and I feel like everybody should read that book. It's actually a good read. It's well written.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. You have no idea what someone like that might go through, what their experience might be, and it's just very eye-opening. And I think too, there's a lot of evangelical. I still have a lot of evangelical friends who just don't understand varieties of sexuality and gender, and they still use sin language there.
Hmm.
That's going to change when you start reading a book like
Hmm.
Intersection.
Yeah. When you were describing like the building of an online community that can then like translate into real community, what does that look like, and how often do you see that done successfully? Because that's the thing that I like when I think about social media and followers, and it's like you have 25,000 followers, but how often did those people actually like ever connect with each other in person or develop a meaningful relationship other than just like I'm watching your 30-second videos or whatever,
Right. Right. I think that's a great question. I don't know that I have the best answer for it other than that. Um, I definitely think we are too quick to condemn social media. I know it has a lot of reasons to be upset about it, but I think people are finding real community. Um, there's a lot of communication that goes on, particularly maybe even some very tighter communities. Um, you're even you're even able to, because it is so segmented, you're even able to sort of specialize in what you like and who you are in a way we've never been able to do before. So you find a sense of identity about that. I think that's quite real. I remember in the days of Napster, I used to I didn't know about like roots music or Americana music or alt country it was called at the time. And I found all these artists, Lucinda Williams, Steve Earle, John Prine, people who've been
Hmm.
around for a while. And like, why have I not seen this before? I've been listening to classic rock all these years.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there's something to that um, in terms of finding out who you are, and that's a sense of community, even if it's somewhat imagined. I do hear stories of people meeting each other online and becoming friends in real life. It there's been hope in the religious space that it would lead to more like conferences and get-togethers, and I think that's not been an automatic. You have places like Wild Goose, or um, uh, there was Evolving Faith, but I think that scaled back quite a bit. Um, there was a really cool conference called Content Warning that only happened once, and they're still trying to keep that going. Um, there is Theology Beer Camp.
Hmm.
Um,
Which we so want to go to sometime.
these are all for different. They're all different crowds.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think and there's also something called the Post Evangelical Collective,
yeah.
which is pretty interesting as
They
well.
have a conference at the end of the month
Yep,
this month. I think
yep,
I might be going to that in Nashville.
yep.
I was telling these guys before you got on, David, that last night I was at Nadia Bolz-Weber's Red State Revival here in
Hmm.
St. Louis, and there were 1,200 people um there to hear,
Yeah,
to
that's amazing
sing,
that
to
she's
be
able to draw
together.
that many. Hmm.
She draws such a huge amount, and she is somebody who, had she not published her memoir, published her books, um, her voice, she was a little, Lutheran pastor,
Hmm.
who just had a really strong voice, and that resonated with a lot of people. And it was such a beautiful group gathering, from all different churches, or from, people who don't go to church, who just maybe follow her Substack. Um, and then, but at the end of it, what she did was she had us all sectioned off into our zip codes. So we had like stickers. So at the end, her call to action was she had us, all 1,200 of us, move around and find our groups. And then we were supposed to make plans to have dinner together with our neighbors.
Nice. Yeah.
So that's an example of, somebody who was so good at creating, um, I don't know if she had an online, a social media audience before she was published, but probably. And then her books really spoke to people. But then certainly online or Substack has created community.
Mm-hmm.
And then moving into actually creating community for other people.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah,
the
that's a good
possibility.
example. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there a book that you're really excited about that's coming out, that you have in the works, that you want to kind of tell us about?
Oh yeah, I mean we've got a wonderful deconstruction memoir of someone who found her own sense of self and faith by traveling in India. So that's a different
Mm,
that's a different
Yeah.
approach on a deconstruction memoir. That's by Lawrence Beanie. That's called Tiger in a Lifeboat. That's out in May. In July, we've got I Hardly Knew Me. It's a transgender memoir by Nia Caramonte. That's not that will be available for pre-order soon. You'll be able to see it on Amazon soon. I'm really excited about that. Nia has had quite a journey, and her there's like humor in it, and her ability to go from some very despairing experiences to this woman who is a HR professional and runs a nonprofit for queer individuals and families, people in transition, um, and has 5 kids with her spouse. It's just a fascinating story. Again, one of those ones where you may have heard of, or you may even know someone who's trans, but have you really heard their story? Got a good book on a follow-up book on our grief book, which is basically the thesis there is like growing up evangelical, we don't really learn about our emotions. And when it comes to the big one of grief, people are often rushed through it. And it's called Faith Doesn't Erase Grief. And her new book is a workbook called Navigating the Waves of Grief. And got a book on spiritual narcissism coming from Becky Garrison, who I think you guys have made touch with. Becky leaves no stone unturned. Fair warning. She's got a great BS meter, I will tell you.
Yeah.
So that should be fascinating. So just talking to a lot of other authors. I do a lot of that. That's on the Lake Drive side.
Yeah, how do these authors how do they find you? You find them? How does they are just sending in a manuscript? What's the process that folks are going through when they end up with you?
Yeah, always. I think a number of them have been recommendations. That human relationship, that human connection thing really helps a lot. People are finding Lake Drive. We're really strong on social media. We don't have a big following, but we're there. We're engaging and interacting. We approach it as we're not just a brand. We count for something, and we want to interact with the community. We won't even just talk about our authors all the time. It'll be others as well. Sometimes it's through, like my book. One author saw my book and really liked it. And this person actually comes from the Catholic side and knows a lot about clergy abuse from inside as a woman. Someone I'm just talking to right now, but hopefully it will transpire. And that's exciting for me. I said I don't even care about your platform to her. I said that to her. Don't tell her I said that. But I just want to learn. I mean, I just want to learn what you know. I mean, you know some stuff, and I think it would be fascinating to get a book out by you. And so yeah, different ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And are you still writing? Are you still you've written books? Are you working on something now?
It's been really challenging to try to make the space for that. But I find that when I am reading and writing in the things that I love the most, the things that you read and write when you're like, I don't care what anybody thinks about this. I love this stuff, so I do that. And I did start up my own Substack. I've got 2 posts going, and they actually really resonated. I can't believe it. One was about the psychological roots of Christian nationalism, and the second one that really resonated was evangelical kids that never get to be kids. And I kind of talk about how we all grow up too fast. I came across this clinician who talked about religion. His book is Psychology of Religious Doubt. It's from decades ago, out of print, but he had a great concept in there called precocious identity formation. And that just really resonated with me. I'm just like, okay, that word just nailed it. And so I've got to talk about that.
Yeah, that is a great phrase.
But I'm hoping to use Substack. I'm hoping to do like 1 a month. That's it. And I'm hoping that will get my brain into writing mode a little bit better.
Yeah.
I mean, writing a book is no small feat. It's
Yeah.
something to take your time with. Um, Working on your writing craft is something to take your time with. I have one author who's published like multiple books. And when he writes, when I see him do writing, it's like, I can't believe how fast he's able to write coherent paragraphs and essays. And I go, it's just got to be all that practice. And then I have other authors who don't have that much
Mm,
practice, and you can see it, and you have to work a little harder. It doesn't mean their ideas aren't strong, but that writing craft, it really does matter. Everybody wants to write a book, but it's not that easy. It's not that
Yeah.
simple.
Now, are you
Yeah.
editing everything that's going through your house right now, or do you have editors or?
Yep, have editors. I have been doing the main edit, but I'm trying
Yeah.
to offload that onto someone who's just joined our group, an editor named Stephanie
Nice.
Eagleson. You can see on our about page. We've got a hearty 3-person team. The others are
Nice.
part-timers with me being, full-time contract work, but
Mhm.
they're in it
Yeah.
we're in it as a team. But yeah, there's freelance editors we use for copy editing, proofreading, design, typesetting. It's a professional job. It's a different model in that, it costs at least $7,500 to put a book together and to
Mhm.
publish it. That doesn't count the printing, the cost of the
Yeah.
printing. But we do things POD, so that helps with that.
Mhm.
So I just ask for authors to join in that cost, but then they get a much better royalty, and then they get a really good hands-on experience as an author experience. We do great marketing compared, we're punching way above our weight.
Mhm.
I see what goes on at other publishers, and I know I'm doing a very good job by my authors. But it's tough. It's tough in terms of getting those unit sales out there and making money on it and scaling, and especially in this sort of more marginalized space.
Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about the first when you talked about the two Substacks that you wrote, the first one that you mentioned, that sounded like an interesting topic. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that essay was about.
Yeah. So I went back on just the idea that when you're a kid, like, within evangelical spaces, or maybe you don't, but that there's there's sort of this pressure, even as like I think 5 is sort of like the magic number when you're like supposed to accept Jesus
Mm.
into your heart, and like families will even like celebrate.
Mhm.
Um, but I think developmentally, it's not a good thing. It's not a healthy thing, especially the evangelical style version of it, because evangelical style version is, I'm a sinner, I need Jesus, I say a scripted prayer, and now I'm suddenly fine.
Yeah.
And that's the same whether you're 5 years old or whether you're 35 or you're 55.
Mm.
And I often look at it as a lot of evangelical parents project that conversion experience, that sort of Billy Graham conversion experience, where I was this adult who I was a lech, I was a wretch, I was a smoker, I was a drinker, I
Yeah.
was a partier, I was whatever.
Yeah.
Now I'm this Bible reading, church going Christian. And you put that on a 5-year-old and they just want to play. That's just
Yeah.
developmentally inappropriate.
Right.
And it kind of gets that concept of original sin, where you're taking on the original, like you're 5 years old and you're being asked to say, I'm a sinner. No 5-year-old should
Yeah.
have to think that through. And so what happens is you start to split. You start to split who you are, or you shut down who you are, or you foreclose it. There's a psychologist who talks about that. I'm not going to remember the psychologist's name, but it's in Crispin Mayfield's Substack, Strong-Willed. You foreclose on yourself, and you shut down, but you also then project onto the others the sins that you can't have for yourself, the
Mhm.
desires you can't own for yourself. You project them onto others.
Yeah.
And that just begins the whole path for evangelical psychology that buys right into Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
I know that's a big sweeping statement, but
No, but
that is part of the origination of what's going on, and why we can, like, you can be a Christian but vote for one of the most unchristian candidates
yeah.
that we've ever seen in history
Yep. Yep. There's
in terms of his behavior, not his policy per se,
Yeah.
but just
Yeah.
the behavior, the
Yep.
ethics,
yeah.
the crimes.
That idea of like that kind of conversion. I don't know if I think William James, the psychologist, wrote about like conversion and instant conversions and I forget what the term is for conversions that happen over a long period of time, um uh but that idea of like the drunk, right?
Hmm.
That would have like an instant conversion and then be saved. And like that was a big I wrote about this when I wrote about like the AA movement and that idea of what that kind of conversion process looks like. And that is exactly what is projected on that 5-year-old, here I'm going to hand you this free, pretty white Bible, and
Right.
you're going to say this language, and then we're going to make a bracelet. And I don't know if you remember these, like we either made bracelets or maybe the boys made bookmarks, but you would have the black bead that would represent our sin, and then you'd have the red bead that would uh represent Jesus' blood. So it was like, I'm evil, then somebody, this blood had to be shed. So it was so like graphic. And then there was the green for now I'm going to grow. Now I have the potential to be a growing, fruitful person. Um and then it was like white, I was going to be pure. And because
Yeah.
I grew, I would have the potential to be ultimately good, and then gold, and then because of that, my purity, then I would go to heaven. I mean,
The streets paved with gold.
the streets are paved with gold. I mean, that was like this not, and it wasn't just a story. Like it was sold to us as ultimate truth. Um, yeah, I mean it's just, yeah, how can we not be completely messed up by that?
Erin, how do you see that? You did not grow up evangelical, I
I
believe,
didn't
right?
no, yeah. So I was raised Catholic. And it was interesting, like so my mom grew up in like a Unitarian style church. My dad was raised Catholic, and then he had gotten divorced, but had never gotten an annulment. So he was kind of like, "You're not really a part of this anymore." But we were in this small town that like everyone was Catholic, right? I went to Catholic school from the time I was in kindergarten through high school. So I was sort of like in the culture, but like from a home life experience, nobody was putting a lot of pressure on, myself or my siblings to like really, adhere to Catholic ideology. It was sort of like you went to school and you learned about these different things. And I actually like, it's kind of, for the most part, it was generally like a pretty positive experience. Like it was not, most of my teachers were not super like fundamentalist in like their approach to anything. Even the priests that I interacted with were like pretty open, which was interesting. And it really wasn't until so I'm gay, which I knew from the time that I was little, and that obviously didn't really like come to a head until I got older. But once I was in high school, and then became sort of like a problem, right? Like in this like small community, in this small town Catholic community. And I, even though, I was pretty involved in a lot of the, like, I was in like a Christian leadership club and did the helped lead Kairos retreats. And like, there were things that I mean, and I generally was like, these are awesome experiences that are bringing people together in community. I'm like, you could do this around a lot of things. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be a religious. I mean, that was kind of where I think my interest in sort of human psychology came into play. It was like that there's a human desire to be in connection with others and have meaning and purpose, and like have feel like we're sort of connected by something that's bigger than just ourselves, right? And but that force could be something outside of religion. I think it was kind of going through that experience of sort of being like pushed out of a community that for the generally like had been pretty positive, that I was like, I mean, that was obviously very difficult, but I think it also gave me a different perspective on like, you can achieve the things in that I saw that were valuable to people, but we could achieve these in other, like with other vehicles, with other vessels. It doesn't have to be just like the Catholic Church. It could be anything, right? Like so now I like help run a company, and it's like, well, we can create the values that we want to run a business on here, and like come together and build something together, right? It doesn't have to be these like big institutions that are, I mean, I think they serve a purpose, right? Like there's obviously value in any sort of organization that can like bring people together and offer meaning and purpose, right? But like, you know, um, I think when we get into situations where people are sort of being pushed out of those communities, and just like we've been talking about, right? They're sort of lost, right? You're like, well, where do I belong? What is important? How do I move on? We have to give we have to be able to create places for people to go, where they can still sort of like, figure out, who am I? What do I believe in? And I don't know. So that was kind of that was my journey, kind of growing up. And so not particularly like, not like you guys and,
Didn't
your
get that big
evangel.
dose at such an early age. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
same kind of
Yeah.
dose anyway. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even though you were taking the literal body and blood of Jesus.
Yep. But I was even like, back then I was like, that's not true.
But they weren't like pounding that into you.
No. And I mean, and maybe a different, like, if I also wonder, like, if my parents had been much more rigid in their approach, like maybe, another, kid that was growing up in that exact same environment may have, like, in terms of the cultural environment, if they had a really strong, like, push at home, may have absorbed everything very differently. I was always sort of like, well, there seems like there's some wiggle room in here, right? Like, and that I always kind of, I mean, I think I like always sensed that there was like, there was some daylight between what was, being like, what was, being communicated in the culture, and like, well, what is really real? Like, there was always room for questioning.
Yeah.
And eventually you found that you could do that questioning and thinking without necessarily being in that milieu of a lot of attendance at Catholic activities and so on.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I think the thing that we're all kind of working on is that Christianity has just been so normative in the United States. Like I would venture that for a post-industrial Western country, our Catholic attendance is even higher than in Europe. Like you have countries like Denmark and Sweden that are known for being some of the least religious countries in the world, but people still identify as religious in a certain way. I don't think they're Catholic there per se as much, but and by the way, those are some of the happiest places. Where people rate their happiness. Those are some of the happiest places, and yet there's less religion there.
Yeah.
I think we're walking that path slowly in the United States, and I think it starts to become, how do we identify or how do we live out our values? How do we feel like we're doing that in a way that feels like um, we're making a difference in the world? We're connecting with things that are bigger than ourselves. We're seeing beauty, that beauty we saw, maybe Kelley, you saw in church. That's the big question, is how do we find those things now? And maybe I was on an interview once with David Hayward, the cartoonist, Naked Pastor.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he made this comment that just still blows me away today. And he said, maybe I don't, after talking about leaving the church where he was a pastor, and he said, I realized maybe I don't need community as much as I thought I did.
Mm.
At least that church community.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Maybe I can find it in other ways. And that was very revealing to me, because a lot of us who have left church have talked about, well, I really miss my community. Well,
Yeah.
maybe that's telling you something, like
Yeah.
you needed it too badly. And now you're finding a better balance with that. And I think that's what we're all working on right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's I think that need for we talked a lot about on the podcast for needing for community, but yeah, that what is it? Eugene Peterson said, like, find the smallest and the closest church to you, which I always thought was great. And even, yeah, like I was out with cocktails with a friend the other night, and I was like, to me, this is church. Like, me and you sitting here having a cocktail and talking about, you know, things that matter,
Yeah.
that's church. And reading a book, sitting in that, to me, that's even right. I'm sitting and having a conversation with this person that's not even in the room as I read this book, and that's church too.
This has been an awesome conversation. Before we let you go, can you share with the audience where they can find you, find your authors, find their books?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, my daughter once said, "Dad, you maintain too many websites." But Lake Drive Books is at lakedrivebooks.com. I'm at davidrmorris.me or dvdmorris@substack.com. You'll find me out there. My literary agency, we didn't talk about that, is hyponymous.com. I work with kind of the same authors there. It just gets scaled a little higher working through other publishers, but it's all the same books to help you heal, grow, and discover.
David, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, you're
today.
welcome. Thank you for the interest. Thanks for looking at my book too. And yeah, I really appreciate
this was
that.
a great conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on Atheist. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with a friend. We really appreciate our listeners. It's because of you we keep growing and connecting with new people.
We always love hearing from our listeners. Get in touch with us at atheistpodcast.com. Follow us on our socials or leave a comment on this episode.
Atheist is produced by Justin Sywell of STL Podcasts.
Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.